Hey, what's going on, guys? This is Matt, and today we are brewing an American light lager. I've actually brewed this style in the past with Kveik yeast, but I'm actually using lager yeast and doing a pressure fermentation. I also want to take a second to thank my channel members, so thank you so much for becoming a channel member. Anyway, guys, we're going to go ahead and jump into Beersmith 3 to talk about the recipe, and then we're going to go ahead into the brew day. Now to jump into Beersmith 3 to talk about the light lager. This is going to be a 5.2 gallon batch. This recipe is going to be very similar to the pseudo light lager recipe I did a while back, except we're just changing out the yeast. The grain bill is going to be 75% Pilsner and 25% flaked rice. For the hops, we're just using Hallertauer. This is only going to provide around 11 IBUs, so this is really just to balance out the sweetness from the malt. And then for the yeast, we're using American lager yeast, White Labs WLP 840. For the fermentation schedule, we can either do one of two things. Since this is lager yeast, we can do a traditional lager where we pitch this cold from around 50 to 55 degrees and hold that for around a week to a week and a half, and then ramp it up for a diacetyl rest. Or we can try a pressure fermentation, and that's what we're going to try today. A pressure fermentation is essentially just holding ale temps, so around 68 degrees for the entirety of the fermentation schedule, around 2 weeks. But while holding that temperature, we can apply pressure to the fermentation vessel, somewhere between 10 to 15 psi. The reason we're applying a pressure on the fermentation vessel is really just to suppress the undesirable flavors that could be generated when fermenting with lager yeast at higher temperatures. More specifically, to limit ester production. As far as how we're applying pressure, we're going to be actually filling the vessel up with CO2 to start with to around 12 psi. And then we're going to set our spunning valve to hold around 12 psi, so as there is more CO2 released during fermentation, the spunning valve will help regulate that 12 psi so it doesn't become dangerous. Next, we can go into the starter information. Now, since this is a lager, Beersmith 3 typically recommends doubling the amount of yeast, but since we're actually using normal ale temperatures, there really is no need to double the cell count. This is one benefit of using pressure fermentation over traditional lager fermentation. And lastly, we could jump into the water chem. So this is the water chem. It's relatively balanced, and I pretty much use this water chemistry for all my American light lagers. Next, we can go ahead and jump into the brew day. First, we double crushed our grains so we can get a fine crush. Then we start heating up our strike water and add our brewing salts. After we hit strike temp, we dough in. We take some time to stir in the mash to break up any dough balls. We set our controller to hold 148 degrees for the duration of the mash. After 15 minutes into the mash, we take a pH reading and it measures out to target 5.3 pH. Once we complete our 60-minute mash and a 10-minute mash out, we raise the grain basket up to start heating up to boiling. We also sparge with 1 gallon of room temperature water. We take a pre-boil gravity reading and it measures out to 1036, which was on target. After we hit a boil, we add 0.8 ounces of Hallertauer. And with 15 minutes left, we add our yeast nutrient and Warflock. At this time, we also run boiling wort through the pumps, line, and chiller to sanitize the equipment. Once we cool down to around 70 degrees, we move the wort over to a fermenter and pitch our American lager yeast. Next, we added around 1 liter of oxygen into a carb stone in the side of the fermenter. We take our original gravity and it measures out to around 1039, which was on target. We set our controller to hold 67 degrees for fermentation. At this time, we also pre-pressurize the fermenter to hold 13 psi, and we set our spunning valve to hold this as well. After 2 weeks in the fermenter, we sanitize our keg and do a closed pressure transfer to limit oxygen pickup. Finally, we take a gravity reading and it measures out a little high at 1011, so our ABV measures out to around 3.7%.
Here we
part at the end of the video where I talk about the brew day and also talk about tasting notes on the American Light Lager. Now, I have done a American Light Lager video in the past, but that was a pseudo American Light Lager using quake yeast, fermented at 90 degrees. This is a little bit different. It's actually the same recipe, but I'm using White Labs 840 yeast on this, and I actually did a pressure fermentation for the first time. I've never done a pressure fermentation because I've really never had the hardware to do it. I recently upgraded my fermenter that I showcased in my last grain glass video, but I want to hold off on making a video on that just yet until I get a few more beers through it. For pressure, I did about 10 to 15 PSI on pressure. I wasn't really sure what to do. I've seen some videos have as low as 5 PSI and some people have as high as 15 PSI. Overall, I just tried to shoot around 12 if I could, but it was probably around 10 to 15 PSI. I think I like this beer more than the pseudo variant, but it's hard to tell because I actually don't have a side-by-side comparison. Maybe I just think it tastes better because I'm actually using lager yeast instead of using quake. It could be entirely in my head. I don't know until I maybe do like a video where I do a side-by-side. But I think I enjoy this a little better. I wanted to try to use lager yeast with this style because I actually submitted my last American Light Lager, the pseudo, in a competition here in Michigan called the Michigan Beer Cup, and I got second place in that under International Pale Lager, which I thought was pretty funny considering it was a pseudo. When I was reading over the judges' notes, they actually mentioned a few things, like there was some fruity esters and also some floral yeast notes they were picking up. So I thought that maybe they were kind of picking up that it might have been a pseudo, but they didn't actually call it out. I did want to try it out with the 840 since this is an actual lager yeast. That should take care of those slight estery or fruity notes that they're picking up, and it should taste more like a traditional lager. That really about covers it for Brewday Notes and just talking about the beer. I think the Brewday went overall pretty easy. It's a pretty easy recipe. So we can go ahead and go into tasting notes. So we're going to go to appearance, aroma, mouthfeel, and flavor. First of all, with the appearance, it is pretty clear. It's not brilliantly clear, and I know in my last video with the pseudo variant, it was really cloudy, but I gotta tell you, that cleared up super well. Like that was super, like probably the clearest beer I've ever had in time. This has actually been on tap probably for a month now, and I find it with gelatin, and I also used hot side findings like Warflock. And it has gotten really clear, but I wouldn't say it's brilliantly clear, but that's okay. I'm not really sure. The clarity thing has always been difficult for me. Sometimes my beers are really clear, sometimes they're not. I did recently buy some floating dip tubes. This was not served on a floating dip tube, so hopefully that will help make things a little bit more clear in the future, but we're gonna see. The color is a straw pale color, and the head is a white head that does linger for quite a while. Next, we can go into aroma. So for aroma, you're definitely just picking up mainly on like these sweet malty notes. You also do pick up really some subtle like floral and spicy notes as well. That's probably from the Hallertauer hops, but they're really, really subtle. The main aroma here is just kind of like a sweet malt aroma. Next, we can go ahead and go into mouthfeel. So with this style, I mean, it's gonna be a light mouthfeel. There's not a whole lot to this that would increase the body. But yeah, it's just a light, refreshing mouthfeel. And lastly, we can go into flavor. So for flavor, I mean, it's just very refreshing. It's very, very refreshing beer. That's why I like it so much, is because it's really, really drinkable. You can definitely have a few of these and not feel like crap the next day. But it does also have, just like the aroma, a very light malt flavor as well. That's very sweet. And when it comes to bitterness, it's just really not bitter at all. It's just a light, refreshing, sweet malt kind of flavor, which is good. And that's pretty much what you'd aim for in this style anyway. Anyway, guys, that about concludes the video. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel for more content like this. Anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and wrap this one up. We'll see you in the next one. Cheers.